Bob Martinez pushed his cleaning cart down the polished corridors of the Galactic Council station, his worn boots squeaking against the gleaming floor. The massive space station housed representatives from 47 different species, each one convinced they were superior to the humble human maintenance worker who emptied their trash bins and mopped their floors. "Look at the primitive," hissed Ambassador Vextar, a serpentine naga whose scales shimmered with expensive biomodifications. Still using manual labor when any civilized species would have automated such menial tasks millennia ago. Bob didn't look up from his work, carefully cleaning around the delicate crystalline formations that served as the Zephyrian delegate's communication equipment. He'd learned long ago that responding only made things worse. Better to let them think he was too simple to understand their insults. The truth was far different. Bob understood every word spoken in the station's common tongue, plus fragments of dozens of other languages. When you spent 12 hours a day invisible to everyone around you, you heard things. Important things. Things that would have shocked the council members if they knew their primitive janitor was listening. "The humans barely qualify for associate membership," continued Vextar to his companion, a towering Chronari whose chitinous armor gleamed under the artificial lights. "No advanced technology, no psychic abilities, no natural weapons or defenses. They're little more than clever animals." Bob squeezed out his mop and moved to the next section. The conversation was typical. Humans had been granted the lowest possible status in the Galactic Council 3 years ago, mainly because they discovered faster-than-light travel independently. It was an embarrassing oversight for the other species, who had assumed Earth's radio silence meant its inhabitants were still banging rocks together. The reality was more complex. Humans had been listening for decades before they announced their presence. They'd learned about the galactic community, its politics, its prejudices. When first contact finally came, humanity's representatives had presented themselves as eager students, grateful for the opportunity to learn from their betters. It was an act, a very good one. Bob finished cleaning the diplomatic wing and headed toward the restricted archaeological section. This was where the real treasures were kept, artifacts from the predecessor civilization that had vanished millions of years ago, leaving behind technology and mysteries that still baffled the galaxy's greatest minds. As he worked, Bob's fingers traced subtle patterns on his cleaning cart's handle. To any observer, it would look like nervous fidgeting. In reality, he was interfacing with hidden sensors built into the cart's framework, scanning everything around him with instruments far more advanced than anything the Council possessed. The archaeological wing held dozens of predecessor artifacts. Most were incomprehensible even to the galaxy's most brilliant scientists. Strange geometric shapes that hummed with unknown energies. Crystalline matrices that seemed to bend light around themselves. Ancient weapons that refused to activate despite centuries of study. And the crowns. 5 of them, each one different, each one radiating a presence that made most species deeply uncomfortable. They sat in individual containment fields, beautiful and terrible and utterly mysterious. Dr. Ilanth, the station's chief archaeologist, was examining one of the crowns with a team of assistants. Her 3 eyes focused intently on the artifact, while her 4 arms manipulated delicate scanning equipment. "The neural resonance patterns are unlike anything we've ever encountered," she was saying to her team. "The predecessor neural structure must have been fundamentally different from any known species. These crowns are clearly designed for mental interface, but the connection protocols are completely alien." Bob emptied the wastebasket near her workstation, moving slowly to give his sensors more time. The hidden instruments in his cart were recording everything. Energy signatures, quantum fluctuations, even the subtle gravitational distortions the crowns created. "Perhaps they weren't designed for neural interface at all," suggested one of Dr. Ilanth's assistants, a young Vorthan whose crystalline features sparkled with excitement. "The energy patterns could indicate some form of quantum consciousness transfer." "Impossible," Dr. Ilanth replied dismissively. "No biological entity could survive quantum consciousness transfer. The neural pathways would be completely destroyed in the process." Bob almost smiled. The good doctor was both right and wrong. No currently known biological entity could survive the process. But the predecessors hadn't been a currently known species, and they'd built their technology with something very specific in mind. He finished his work in the archaeological section and moved on, but part of his attention remained focused on the data his sensors had collected. The patterns were becoming clearer each day, and soon he would have enough information to confirm what he'd suspected since the first time he'd seen the crowns. The day's shift ended with the usual routine. Bob clocked out, nodded politely to the security guards who barely acknowledged his existence, and took the maintenance shuttle to the station's human quarters. It was a small section, cramped and poorly ventilated, designed to accommodate the handful of humans who worked menial jobs throughout the station. His roommate Jenkins was already there, feet up on their salvaged furniture, watching recordings of Earth sports on a battered tablet. "How was work?" Jenkins asked without looking up. "Same as always," Bob replied, settling into his own chair. "Invisible janitor cleaning up after his betters." Jenkins snorted. "Right. And I'm just a simple food service worker who definitely doesn't have 3 degrees in xenobiology." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, two humans playing their assigned roles in the galactic community's grand theater. Around them, the station hummed with activity as dozens of species went about their business, secure in their superiority over the primitive mammals from Earth. None of them suspected that the primitive mammals had been studying them for far longer than anyone realized. None of them knew that human scientists had reverse-engineered predecessor technology decades ago, or that Earth's apparent technological limitations were carefully maintained fiction. And absolutely none of them realized that the humble human janitor had just figured out how to activate the ancient crowns that had baffled the galaxy's greatest minds for centuries. Bob stared at the ceiling and began planning his next move. Tomorrow, he would return to his cleaning duties, invisible and ignored as always. But soon, very soon, the galaxy would learn that underestimating humans was a mistake that would cost them everything. The predecessors had left their crowns for a reason, and Bob Martinez, the insignificant human janitor, was beginning to understand what that reason was. The next morning brought unexpected excitement to the Galactic Council station. Ambassador Theclon of the Hegemony had arrived unannounced, his massive dreadnought casting shadows across the station's viewing ports. The Hegemony was the galaxy's dominant military power, and Theclon's visits usually meant trouble for someone. Bob pushed his cart through corridors buzzing with nervous energy. Diplomatic staff rushed past him carrying encrypted datapads and speaking in hushed, urgent tones. Security personnel had tripled their patrols, their weapons prominently displayed. Even a normally arrogant species representatives seemed subdued. The Hegemony grows impatient with the Council's indecision. Bob overheard Ambassador Vextar telling a group of his allies. Theclon wouldn't come personally unless they were prepared to take direct action. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. For months, tensions had been building between the Hegemony and the Council over territorial disputes in the outer systems. The Hegemony wanted expansion rights to several star systems that contained valuable resources. The Council had been stalling, hoping to find a diplomatic solution that wouldn't require surrendering entire worlds to Hegemony control. Bob had been monitoring these discussions for weeks, recording everything through his hidden sensors. What the various diplomats didn't know was that Earth had colonies in 3 of the disputed systems. Secret colonies established decades ago when humans had first developed faster-than-light travel. Officially, humanity was too primitive and resource-poor to have established any significant off-world presence. In reality, humans have been quietly spreading throughout the galaxy for 50 years. As Bob cleaned the main diplomatic chamber, he watched Ambassador Theclon address the assembled council. The Hegemony leader was massive even by the standards of his species, standing nearly 4 meters tall with 4 powerful arms and a carapace that gleamed like polished metal. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. "The Council has had sufficient time to consider our proposal," Fechlon declared, his words echoing through the chamber. We require unrestricted access to the Kepler, Centauri, and Vega systems. Your continued delays serve no purpose except to frustrate the hegemony's legitimate expansion needs. Council Speaker Zarthal, an elderly Yithran whose telepathic abilities made him nearly impossible to deceive, raised one of his many tentacles in a gesture of diplomatic patience. Ambassador Fechlon, surely you understand that such a decision cannot be made hastily. These systems contain inhabited worlds. We must consider the rights of the existing populations. What populations? Fechlon's laugh was like grinding metal. Our surveys show only primitive life forms and uninhabited planets. Nothing that would impede proper development. Bob almost dropped his mop. The hegemony surveys had missed the human colonies completely. That was both good and terrifying news. Good because it meant humanity's stealth technology was more effective than anyone suspected. Terrifying because it meant the hegemony was planning to strip mine worlds that contained millions of human civilians. He finished cleaning the chamber and moved toward the archaeological wing, his mind racing. The situation had just become critical. If the Council surrendered those systems to the hegemony, it would mean genocide for the human populations living there. And if the secret colonies were discovered, it would expose humanity's deception and likely result in Earth itself being targeted for conquest. Unless someone could find a way to stop the hegemony entirely. In the archaeological wing, Dr. Ilanth was working frantically with her team. Word of Fechlon's ultimatum had reached them, and they were desperately searching for anything in the predecessor archives that might provide leverage against the hegemony. The military applications alone would be invaluable, she was telling her assistants as they scanned artifact after artifact. Any functioning predecessor weapon would shift the balance of power completely. Bob emptied trash bins and swept floors while listening to their increasingly desperate attempts to unlock secrets that had remained hidden for millions of years. The irony wasn't lost on him. The galaxy's most brilliant minds were searching for answers that he'd already found, solutions that lay sleeping in technology they couldn't even begin to understand. But Bob understood, not through superior intellect or advanced training, but through something the other species lacked entirely. The predecessors hadn't built their technology for tentacled telepaths or chitinous warriors or serpentine diplomats. They'd built it for creatures very much like humans. He'd spent weeks analyzing the Crown data, running it through quantum processors hidden in Earth's most secure facilities. The results had been startling. The predecessors weren't just similar to humans in some superficial way. They were humans, or something so close to human that the differences were negligible. The crowns weren't alien artifacts at all. They were inheritance, left behind by human ancestors who had achieved technological heights that current humanity could barely comprehend. And they'd hidden that inheritance in plain sight, waiting for their descendants to evolve enough to claim it. The question was whether Bob was ready to reveal that truth to a galaxy that had spent centuries convinced of its own superiority. He completed his rounds and returned to the human quarters, where Jenkins was waiting with news of his own. As a food service worker, Jenkins had access to the station's senior staff dining areas, places where the galaxy's power brokers spoke freely about their plans. "It's bad," Jenkins said without preamble. "The hegemony has given the Council 72 hours to make a decision. If they don't surrender the systems voluntarily, Fechlon plans to take them by force." "How many ships?" Bob asked. 17 dreadnoughts, plus support vessels. Enough firepower to crack planets. Jenkins paused, studying Bob's expression. "You've figured something out, haven't you? That look you get when you're processing data." Bob nodded slowly. "The crowns. I know what they are, and I know how to activate them." That's huge. What do they do?" "I'm not entirely sure yet. But whatever it is, it's powerful enough that the predecessors felt comfortable leaving them unguarded. They knew that only the right species could use them." Jenkins leaned forward. "And you think humans are the right species?" "I think humans are the only species. The predecessors weren't aliens, Jenkins. They were us. Ancient humans who reached the stars long before anyone else in this galaxy evolved past tribal societies. The implications hung in the air between them. If Bob was right, then everything the galactic community believed about history, evolution, and species hierarchy was fundamentally wrong. Humans weren't newcomers to the cosmic stage. They were the original players, returning to reclaim a heritage that was rightfully theirs. So what's the plan? Jenkins asked finally. Bob stood up and began gathering his gear. I'm going to the archaeological wing tonight. It's time to see if I'm right about those crowns. And if you're wrong, then we find another way to save our colonies before the hegemony turns them into slag. Jenkins nodded grimly. They both knew the stakes. 3-star systems full of human civilians were about to become battlegrounds in a war they didn't even know was coming. Unless Bob could unlock secrets that had been hidden for millions of years, humanity's secret expansion into the galaxy would end in massacre. But as Bob prepared for the most important night of his life, he felt a strange calm settling over him. The crowns were calling to him now, their presence growing stronger each time he'd worked near them. Whatever power they contained, whatever legacy the predecessors had left behind, he could feel it responding to his approach. Tomorrow, the galaxy would learn that underestimating the human janitor had been their first mistake, and possibly their last. The station's night cycle brought blessed quiet to the corridors. Security patrols followed predictable routes, and the archaeological wing was sealed behind multiple layers of protection. For most people, breaking into the most secure section of the Galactic Council station would have been impossible. Bob Martinez wasn't most people. The maintenance tunnels that ran behind the station's walls were his domain. He'd mapped every access point, every ventilation shaft, every forgotten maintenance hatch during his 3 years of service. More importantly, he'd gradually been planting human technology throughout the station's infrastructure. Devices so small and advanced that they were invisible to the alien sensors, but which gave Bob complete access to the station's security systems. He made his way through the tunnels with practiced ease, carrying a small toolkit that contained instruments far more sophisticated than anything the Galactic Council possessed. When he reached the archaeological wing, he paused to scan for surveillance systems and guard patrols. The area was empty except for the automated sensors, which Bob's devices had already compromised. He dropped silently into the main laboratory and approached the containment fields that held the 5 ancient crowns. Up close, their beauty was even more striking. Each crown was unique in design, but clearly part of a matched set. The first was wrought from what appeared to be crystallized starlight, its facets catching and reflecting photons that seemed to come from nowhere. The second was forged from metal that shifted color as he watched, cycling through hues that had no names in any known language. The third appeared to be made of living wood that somehow continued to grow despite being cut from any tree millions of years ago. The fourth crown was the most unsettling. It seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, its edges becoming unclear whenever Bob tried to focus on them directly. And the fifth crown was simplest in appearance, but most complex in presence, appearing to be carved from ordinary stone while radiating power that made the air itself feel thick and charged. Bob activated his scanning equipment and began detailed analysis of the containment fields. The energy barriers were sophisticated, designed to contain artifacts that defied known physics. But they'd been built by species who didn't understand what they were really containing. The fields weren't just protecting the station from the crowns. They were protecting the crowns from contamination by non-human neural patterns. The predecessors had built safeguards into their legacy, ensuring that only the right genetic and mental patterns could activate their inheritance. It took Bob nearly an hour to safely disable the containment field around the first crown. The moment the barriers dropped, he felt a change in the air. The crown's presence became more immediate, more welcoming. It was as if the artifact had been sleeping for millions of years and was now beginning to wake up. He reached out slowly and touched the crystalline surface. The reaction was instant and overwhelming. Images flooded his mind, not memories exactly, but something deeper, genetic memories encoded in human DNA, activated by contact with technology that had been waiting eons for this moment. Bob saw Earth as it had been millions of years ago, when the first human civilization had reached for the stars. He saw cities that floated among the clouds and ships that sailed between dimensions. He saw a race of beings who looked exactly like modern humans, but who had achieved technological heights that made current galactic civilization look like children playing with sticks. And he saw why they had left. The predecessors hadn't vanished or died out. They had ascended to something beyond physical existence, becoming entities of pure consciousness that existed in higher dimensional spaces. But before their transformation, they had prepared for the possibility that their younger cousins might one day need their help. The crowns were keys, not just to technology, but to genetic potential that lay dormant in every human being. Abilities that had been locked away for millions of years, waiting for the moment when humanity would need to reclaim its true heritage. As the first crown settled on Bob's head, he felt those locks beginning to open. His consciousness expanded beyond the confines of his skull, reaching out to touch the quantum substrates that underlay all reality. He could sense every living being on the station, their thoughts and emotions like distant radio signals. More than that, he could feel the vast networks of technology that surrounded them, all of it suddenly transparent to his enhanced perception. But that was only the beginning. Bob moved to the second crown, the metal one that shifted colors. When he placed it beside the first, the reaction was exponential rather than additive. New abilities awakened in his mind, the power to manipulate matter at the molecular level, to bend space-time around himself, to project force fields that could stop starship weapons. The third crown brought mastery over biological systems. Bob could suddenly perceive the genetic structure of every organism on the station. More importantly, he could modify those structures, healing injuries, enhancing capabilities, or simply understanding the fundamental patterns that made each species unique. The fourth crown, the one that existed in multiple dimensions, opened pathways to parallel realities. Bob could see alternate timelines spreading out like branches from the present moment, each one showing different possibilities for the future. In some, the hegemony conquered the disputed systems and continued expanding until they controlled the entire galaxy. In others, various species found ways to resist, leading to wars that would devastate countless worlds. But in a few timelines, something else happened. In those realities, humanity stepped out of the shadows and took its rightful place as the galaxy's protector rather than its conqueror. The fifth crown completed the set, and Bob understood why the predecessors had divided their legacy among 5 separate artifacts. No single mind, no matter how enhanced, could safely contain all of their accumulated knowledge and power. But distributed among the 5 crowns, that power could be channeled and controlled. Bob Martinez, the humble human janitor, stood alone in the archaeological laboratory with the combined technological and psychic heritage of an ancient civilization resting on his head. Around him, the very air seemed to shimmer with potential energy as reality bent to accommodate forces that hadn't been active for millions of years. He could feel the hegemony fleet approaching through hyperspace, their ships loaded with weapons capable of sterilizing worlds. He could sense Ambassador Theclon's thoughts, full of arrogance and contempt for the species he considered inferior. He could perceive the fear and helplessness of the council members who saw no way to prevent a war that would cost billions of lives. And he could see the 3 hidden human colonies in the disputed systems, millions of civilians who had no idea that their existence was about to be discovered and their lives terminated. But Bob could also see something else. A path forward that the galaxy's greatest minds had missed, a solution that would save not just the human colonies, but potentially reshape the entire galactic community. The predecessors had left more than just the crowns behind. Hidden throughout the galaxy were caches of technology, ancient weapons, and defensive systems that could neutralize threats on a galactic scale. But those caches have been locked away, waiting for someone with the proper genetic and technological keys to claim them. Bob now held those keys. He reached out with his enhanced consciousness and began activating systems that had slept since before the current galactic civilization had even learned to use fire. Ancient satellites powered up in distant star systems. Defensive platforms that had been disguised as asteroids for millions of years began emerging from their camouflage. And deep beneath the surface of hundreds of worlds, forgotten facilities began preparing for activation. The galaxy was about to learn that the predecessors hadn't really vanished. They had simply been waiting for the right moment to return. And that moment had finally arrived. Ambassador Theclon strode into the council chamber with the confidence of someone who held all the cards. His massive frame dominated the space as he took his position at the center of the diplomatic circle, for arms crossed in a gesture that suggested both patience and barely contained violence. "The hegemony's deadline has passed," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Your failure to respond appropriately has forced us to take more direct action." Around the chamber, representatives from dozens of species shifted nervously in their seats. Some tried to maintain diplomatic composure, while others openly displayed their fear. The balance of power in the galaxy was about to shift dramatically, and everyone knew it. Council Speaker Zarthal raised one tentacle in a futile gesture of diplomacy. "Ambassador, surely we can find a peaceful resolution. Perhaps if we were to offer alternative systems for development." "The time for negotiation has ended," Theclon interrupted. "Our fleet has already entered the disputed systems. Any resistance will be met with overwhelming force." What Theclon didn't say, but what every being in the chamber understood, was that overwhelming force meant planetary bombardment. The hegemony had ended territorial disputes this way before, turning entire worlds into molten slag to demonstrate their superiority. Bob Martinez stood in the corner of the chamber, invisible as always, his cleaning cart positioned where it wouldn't interfere with the proceedings. To anyone looking, he appeared to be just another piece of maintenance equipment, too insignificant to notice. But beneath his humble exterior, Bob was operating on levels of awareness that none of the assembled diplomats could imagine. The 5 predecessor crowns rested invisibly on his head, their combined power hidden by technology that bent light and perception around him. He could feel the thoughts and emotions of every being in the chamber, could sense their despair as they realized how helpless they were against the hegemony's military might. He could also sense something else. 3-star systems away, hegemony dreadnoughts were beginning their assault on what they believed were uninhabited worlds. Their sensors couldn't detect the human colonies hidden beneath sophisticated camouflage, but their weapons would soon make that irrelevant. In less than 6 hours, unless something changed dramatically, millions of human civilians would be dead. Through the quantum networks activated by the crowns, Bob reached out to the hidden human colonies. Emergency broadcasts began transmitting across encrypted channels that the hegemony couldn't detect. Evacuation procedures that had been planned for decades went into immediate effect. But evacuation would only save some of the colonists. The rest needed a different kind of protection. Bob began activating the predecessor defensive systems he discovered throughout the galaxy. Ancient weapons platforms that had been disguised as natural phenomena for millions of years suddenly came online. Asteroid mining stations revealed themselves to be massive defensive installations. Seemingly dead moons opened up to expose technology that could reshape matter at the subatomic level. The effect was immediate and startling. Throughout the 3 disputed star systems, hegemony ships found themselves surrounded by defensive fields that hadn't been there moments before. Their weapons fire was absorbed harmlessly by barriers that operated on principles their scientists couldn't understand. Their navigation systems began reporting impossible readings as space itself seemed to bend around them. In the council chamber, Theclon suddenly stiffened. One of his subordinates was speaking urgently into his communication device, reporting developments that clearly hadn't been anticipated. "What do you mean, defensive systems?" Theclon demanded. Our survey showed no military installations in those systems. The chamber fell silent as everyone strained to listen. Through his enhanced hearing, Bob could follow both sides of the conversation clearly. Sir, we're detecting massive energy signatures throughout all three systems. The fleet commander was reporting. Unknown technology, far beyond anything in our databases. Our ships are being held in some kind of stasis field. We can't move, and our weapons have no effect. Theclon's expression shifted from confidence to confusion to growing alarm. That's impossible. No known species possesses defensive technology capable of stopping a hegemony fleet. No known species, Bob said quietly, stepping forward from his position near the wall. Every head in the chamber turned toward him. For a moment, there was complete silence as the assembled diplomats tried to process the sight of a human maintenance worker speaking up in the middle of a critical diplomatic crisis. What did you say, human? Theclon's voice carried dangerous incredulity. Bob began removing the perceptual camouflage that had hidden the crowns, allowing their true glory to become visible. The crystalline crown caught and reflected light that seemed to come from other dimensions. The metal crown shifted through colors that had never been seen before. The livingwood crown pulsed with organic energy that made the air itself feel more alive. The multidimensional crown seemed to exist in several realities simultaneously, and the stone crown radiated power that made reality itself seem more solid and reliable. I said no known species, Bob repeated, his voice now carrying harmonics that resonated in frequencies most of the assembled beings couldn't even perceive. But you've never really known humanity, have you? You've only seen what we wanted you to see. Ambassador Vextar was the first to recover from shock enough to speak. Those are the predecessor artifacts. How did you? Because they were never predecessor artifacts, Bob explained, his consciousness expanding to encompass the entire chamber. Every being present could suddenly feel his presence, a weight of awareness and power that dwarfed anything they'd ever experienced. They were human artifacts, left behind by our ancestors millions of years ago, waiting for us to evolve enough to reclaim our heritage. The implications hit the chamber like a physical force. If Bob was telling the truth, then everything they believed about galactic history was wrong. Humans weren't newcomers to space travel. They weren't primitive mammals who had recently stumbled on a faster-than-light technology. They were the inheritors of the most advanced civilization the galaxy had ever known. Impossible, Theclon snarled, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. Humans are barely more advanced than their own ancestors were a few thousand years ago. We've seen your technology. We've studied your capabilities. You've seen what we wanted you to see, Bob replied. Did you really think a species capable of developing FTL travel independently would be as primitive as we appeared? Did it never occur to you that our apparent limitations might be deliberate? Through the quantum networks, Bob began revealing the truth about humanity's actual capabilities. Hidden shipyards throughout the galaxy suddenly became visible to every sensor in the chamber. Fleets of human vessels, built with technology that made hegemony dreadnoughts look like children's toys, began emerging from camouflage. Colonies that had been invisible for decades revealed themselves on worlds throughout the galaxy. But most shocking of all were the defensive installations. Ancient human technology had been hiding in plain sight for millions of years, disguised as natural phenomena. Every major star system in the galaxy contained hidden defensive platforms. Every important world was protected by barriers that could stop any conventional weapon. The galaxy had been under human protection for longer than most species had existed. The question now, Bob continued, his awareness encompassing star systems light years away, is what comes next. Your fleet is currently being held harmless, but immobile in the disputed systems. Your weapons are useless against technology that your species can't understand. You have a choice to make. Theclon's four arms trembled with rage and fear. What choice? Join the galactic community as an equal partner, or continue your expansion policies and discover just how protective the human species can be when our friends are threatened. Through the neural links established by the crowns, Bob was simultaneously coordinating with human command centers on a dozen worlds, managing defensive systems across hundreds of star systems, and preparing for possibilities that ranged from peaceful resolution to total war. The galaxy's balance of power hadn't just shifted. It had been completely overturned. And the humble human janitor, who had been invisible for 3 years, was now the most powerful being in known space. Ambassador Theclon looked around the chamber, seeing the fear and awe in the faces of beings who had considered him the ultimate authority just moments before. His fleet was trapped, his plans were in ruins, and the species he dismissed as barely worthy of notice had just revealed themselves to be the descendants of gods. The choice he faced would determine not just the fate of the hegemony, but the future of galactic civilization itself. The silence in the council chamber stretched for what felt like an eternity. Ambassador Theclon stood frozen, his massive frame trembling as he processed the complete reversal of everything he thought he knew about galactic power dynamics. Around him, representatives from dozens of species stared at the human maintenance worker who had just revealed himself to be something far beyond their comprehension. Bob Martinez remained calm at the center of the storm he'd created. The 5 predecessor crowns, no, the 5 human crowns, continued to channel power that made reality itself more flexible around him. Through quantum networks that spanned the galaxy, he could feel the presence of millions of other humans, all of them suddenly connected by technology that their ancestors had left sleeping for millions of years. The hidden human colonies were safe now, protected by defensive systems that could withstand anything the hegemony might throw at them. But more than that, the entire galactic community was about to undergo a transformation that would reshape civilization itself. "You're lying," Theclon said finally, his voice lacking conviction. "This is some kind of elaborate deception. No species could hide such capabilities for so long." Bob smiled sadly. "Ambassador, you're thinking like a conqueror instead of a protector. We didn't hide our capabilities to deceive you. We hid them to protect you." "Protect us? From what?" Instead of answering directly, Bob expanded his consciousness to encompass the entire galaxy, allowing every being in the chamber to share in his enhanced perception. Suddenly, they could see what he saw, not just the physical universe, but the quantum substrates that underlay all existence. And in those deeper levels of reality, they saw the threats that had been approaching for millennia. From beyond the galactic rim, things that were not quite matter and not quite energy were slowly making their way toward inhabited space. Ancient entities that fed on consciousness itself, drawn by the growing complexity of galactic civilization. They were still centuries away, but their advanced scouts had already begun probing the galaxy's outer defenses. The assembled diplomats gasped as they perceived beings of such alien malevolence that their own species' conflicts seemed insignificant by comparison. These entities didn't want territory or resources. They wanted to consume every thinking being in the galaxy, to drain the life force from entire star systems until nothing remained but empty space. The predecessors, our ancestors, knew this day would come, Bob explained as he gently withdrew the shared vision. They built the defensive networks not just to protect humanity, but to protect all life in the galaxy. Every species, no matter how different, represents a unique perspective on existence that these entities would destroy forever. Council Speaker Zarthal was the first to find his voice. "How long have you known about these things?" "Humans have been monitoring the situation for 50 years, Bob replied. "Our deep space sensors detected the first scout probes before most of your species even knew we existed. We've been preparing defenses ever since." Ambassador Vextar coiled nervously, his serpentine form betraying agitation that went beyond simple fear. "If what you're saying is true, then why didn't you reveal yourselves sooner? Why maintain the deception?" "Because we needed to understand you first," Bob said simply. Every species in this galaxy would be fighting for survival against these entities. We needed to know if you could work together, or if you'd tear each other apart at the first sign of external threat. The answer hung unspoken in the chamber. Everyone present knew how the galactic community operated, through dominance hierarchies, territorial disputes, and constant competition for resources and influence. The idea of dozens of species cooperating against a common threat was almost unthinkable. "And what did you conclude?" asked Dr. Island, speaking for the first time since Bob had revealed his true nature. "That you're better than you think you are, but not as good as you need to be," Bob replied. The hegemony's expansion policies are a perfect example. Instead of building alliances and strengthening defenses, you've been focused on conquering each other. Theclon's four arms clenched into fists. "The hegemony has brought order to chaos. Our expansion has created stability. Your expansion has created division," Bob interrupted. "And division makes all of us vulnerable to what's coming." Through the quantum networks, Bob began sharing tactical data that painted a terrifying picture. The entities from beyond the rim weren't just powerful. They were intelligent in ways that conventional minds couldn't grasp. They turned species against each other, fed on conflict and fear, and grew stronger with every civilization they consumed. But the data also showed something else. Simulations run by human quantum computers over decades had identified potential strategies for survival. If the galactic community could unite, if they could coordinate their defenses and share their technologies, there was a chance, not a certainty, but a real chance of survival. "What are you proposing?" Council Speaker Zarthal asked quietly. Bob gestured, and holographic displays materialized throughout the chamber, showing star maps that included defensive installations most of the assembled beings had never imagined. Human ships moved in formations that dwarfed anything the hegemony could muster, but they were positioned defensively rather than aggressively. "Full integration," Bob said, "shared technology, coordinated defense networks, and an end to territorial expansion in favor of mutual protection. We're offering to reveal everything, all of our technology, all of our capabilities, all of our knowledge about what's coming." "In exchange for what?" Theclon demanded. "Peace. Real peace, not just the absence of war. An agreement that from this moment forward, every species in the galaxy works together for mutual survival instead of individual advantage." The proposal was staggering in its scope. For species that had spent millennia competing for dominance, the idea of genuine cooperation was almost incomprehensible. But the alternative was extinction at the hands of entities that made their worst nightmares seem pleasant by comparison. Dr. Ilanth was studying the tactical displays with growing excitement. "The defensive technologies you're showing, they're based on principles we've never even theorized. The energy requirements alone should be impossible. They're based on understanding reality at levels your current science hasn't reached yet," Bob explained. "But that knowledge can be shared. The predecessors, our ancestors, designed these systems to be operated by any sufficiently advanced intelligence, not just humans. And if we refuse?" Theclon's voice was carefully controlled. Bob's expression grew sad. "Then we continue protecting the galaxy alone, as we have been for the past 50 years. Your ships will be released unharmed, and you can continue your expansion policies until the entities arrive and consume everything you've built." The choice was clear, but its implications were overwhelming. Accept human leadership and sacrifice everything that had defined galactic civilization for millennia, or maintain independence and face extinction. Around the chamber, Bob could feel the thoughts and emotions of dozens of species as they grappled with this impossible decision. Fear, pride, desperation, and hope swirled together in a complex mixture that would determine the fate of trillions of beings. Ambassador Vextar was the first to speak. "If we agree to this alliance, what guarantee do we have that humanity won't simply become the new hegemony? Because we've had the power to become the new hegemony for 50 years, and we chose not to," Bob replied. "We could have conquered this galaxy at any point since we achieved space travel. Instead, we chose to protect it in secret, to study it, to understand it. We want partners, not subjects. The debate that followed lasted for hours. Representatives questioned every aspect of Bob's proposals, demanded proof of every claim, and explored every possible alternative. But gradually, as more evidence was presented and more threats became clear, consensus began to emerge. The galaxy stood at a crossroads. Down one path lay the continuation of old patterns, competition, conquest, and eventual extinction when the entities from beyond arrived. Down the other lay something unprecedented in galactic history, true cooperation between species, shared knowledge and resources, and perhaps the first real chance for long-term survival. When the final vote was taken, it was unanimous. Not because every species was enthusiastic about the changes, but because the alternative was too terrible to contemplate. Bob Martinez, the humble human janitor who had been invisible for 3 years, had just become the architect of the galaxy's transformation. The ancient crowns of his ancestors rested on his head as he accepted the responsibility of guiding dozens of species toward a future that none of them could have imagined alone. In the disputed star systems, hegemony ships found their movement restored as human defensive platforms powered down their containment fields. But those same platforms remained visible and active, a reminder that the galaxy now lived under protection that was both more powerful and more benevolent than anything they had known before. The age of conquest was ending. The age of cooperation had begun, and somewhere in the vast darkness between galaxies, ancient entities sensed the change and began to accelerate their approach, drawn by the unprecedented unity of consciousness that was emerging in what they had thought would be an easy meal. The real test of the new galactic alliance was still to come. But for the first time in millions of years, the galaxy's defenders would be ready.